This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 27, Brekkekiten. Being queen sometimes had its perks. What should have been a 12-day journey, riding and hiking across jagged terrain, had been achieved in just 2, thanks to the combined efforts of several barge captains working in tandem and 3 ship changes. They had pushed their ships to the extreme, practically flying across the river. There was something so calming about the open waters of the great river that managed to soothe Pyra to her very soul. The gentle sway of the boat on the waves, the friendly folk, and the familiar chatter. And, of course, the promise of saving her kingdom and her people was close at hand. She closed her eyes and sucked in a peaceful breath of fresh air, letting it course through her. She missed the water, but the calmness that had washed over her evaporated in a heartbeat at the sound of 3 grown men and a bear vomiting violently into the reeds. She exhaled in a huff and turned to face her crewmates. "We're going to lose all the time we made if you lot can't bottle up your ill stomachs." Errik opened his mouth to respond, a waspish feeling rising up in him, but doubled back over, the last bit of yesterday's breakfast replacing his words. In order for them to get to the Wicker Witches and still have time to return to the battlefield, they had been forced to take the river to where it met the ocean and navigate up the rocky coastline until the waters turned black in a wide, marshy inlet. There, they changed from a massive barge to several small, flat-bottomed boats. These slid their way over the shallow water and muddy banks as far as the encroaching mass of cypress-like trees and twisting undergrowth would allow. But the relative reprieve of bumpy swamp boats was short-lived as the nauseating journey across the river and ocean haunted them like an angry spirit. Errik took several moments to compose himself, making sure he could trust his mouth before he turned back to the Queen, dragging a hand across his face.
Some of us weren't made for the water, Your Highness."
He bit back on his words as his stomach did a flop. Pyra clicked her tongue as the prince helped her down from the raft. "Surely, you grown men can handle a simple boat ride?" She turned to see that even Varen was a little green around the edges, but was managing to contain himself. One of the sulky ferrymen shook his head in disbelief.
"I've never seen a bear change colors before."
Having spent the last 2 days tethered near the bow of the ship as a counterweight, Barry had suffered the most. He made several low groans and whimpers before he collapsed where he stood, huffing into the dirt. Errik exhaled slowly, standing upright.
"The time we saved won't be worth anything if we can't manage to walk from here because we have to stop every few minutes to vomit. I've been dehydrated before. It's not fun."
Blinking slowly, Pyra pulled a face. "What matters is that we are here now. What would you have me do? Take it all back and march across the fields of Emberon on foot?" Atlas raised a finger, chiming in with a tutting noise.
No, he's got a point."
His words came to an abrupt halt as he choked back on the gagging sensation at the jostling reminder of the open waters. With huge effort, he swallowed the memories down and continued.
A point."
With a pained groan, Evan rejoined the others from the water's edge, clutching at his stomach. "That river was so choppy, we spent more time in the air than on the water." Pyra snorted through her nostrils. "We should consider ourselves lucky those barge captains knew my father and recognized me." The others failed to thank her for her efforts, and she felt a sour mood return to her. She pushed her hands on her hips. Well, I don't see anyone else with a plan. At least I did something.
What good would a shortcut have been if none of us survived to make the march into the swamps?
Errik cut short his rant with a shake of his head. The thought of having to make this trip purely on horseback made his stomach quiver. And with their luck, something worse might have been waiting for them than just a sour stomach.
But you did get us here, and mostly in one piece, so thanks.
I don't like boat rides no more. Let's stay away from them from now on.
Errik wholeheartedly agreed with his shadow bug. Pyra moved to a nearby stump and collapsed down onto it. Well, it might not have been the most sincere gratitude, but at least it was something. Absently tying her hair back so that it wouldn't catch in the brush, she looked back at Errik, who was still wearing her husband's battle attire. She sighed. They were so close to having him back. Just gather yourself, please. I can't have you vomiting in front of the Wicca Witches. Atlas raised a tentative hand.
Then we're gonna need a few moments before we can hike through a swamp. And I'm gonna have to create some wading shoes for Barry here, so as he don't sink.
Pyra finished the last loops of her braid before she tucked it back into a bun on top of her head. She waved the arcanist off with a hand as she moved to roll up the bottoms of her pant legs. Take all the time you need, but you won't need to make Barry anything, because you won't be joining us. Atlas whipped his head around.
Wait, why not?
Evan chortled and elbowed the mage playfully. Sorry, man. Maybe they don't want you making a scene. Pyra leveled a gaze on the small dwarf. You're not coming either. What? Why not? Undine set her armored crimson boots near the center of their makeshift camp, enjoying the way the black sand moved beneath her toes. The laugh wardens are not the trusting sort, especially towards men. If we bring too many of you with us, they may not show themselves, or they could take offense and suffer us to the swamps, where we could be lost forever and eventually die. It is a risk taking even Errik. Atlas fumed. He would not have traveled all this way across treacherous waters and murky terrain if he had known he wouldn't even get to meet the elusive Wicker Witches.
Well, that's not fair. I've never met a woman I couldn't win over with my charm.
To be honest, he really just wanted to see their display of organic magics. His teachers at the university had always alluded to them, and he had been curious ever since.
Let me join you, and I'll be on my best behavior.
Undine pulled a smile as she exchanged a look with her queen. Perhaps their sacrifice will grant us their favor? Snuffed out like a spent candle, Atlas's desires were extinguished with a snap.
Well, on second thought...
He looked over his shoulder.
Someone has to stay behind and protect this lot.
He gestured at the others with a jab of his thumb. At those words, Evan looked to the queen. And what about Errik? Who's going to protect him if we can't go with? Pyra chuckled as she removed her other shoe. I'm sure Undine will be enough protection for all of us. The Dryad pointed at Bob. The undead will also be joining us. He will protect the False King, of course. Evan turned to look at the zombie. Bob, who had been staring blankly ahead, patiently awaiting orders, appeared to perk up at the thought of joining them. Something about him seemed more animated than usual. How come he gets to go? Won't that incur some wrath or something? Undine could see the little dwarf was put out, crossing his arms with a huff. She reached down and patted him gently on the head. As a creature of undeath, and therefore he is part of the Lafwarden's domain. He is allowed to move about their realm freely. Varen, seeing the others arguing, seized the opportunity and tapped the queen on the shoulder. When she looked up at him, he signed, "Can I have a word with you?" Pyra, peering around the prince, noted that Errik was still dry-heaving in the reeds. She sighed and nodded. "It would seem we have a few extra moments. Do you wish to work some more on your signing?" She offered him a small smile. Things between them had gotten better in the last few days, and she had even taken to helping correct his sloppy sign language. Varen tugged her away, pulling her off to the other side of a crooked tree. "I have reservations about this plan." He knew his signing was clumsy and that he was making numerous mistakes, but he had to tell her. She took a moment to study the prince, searching his face before she shook her head. "Is this about Errik and what he did with the tree?" Varen shook his head. "No. Well, yes, that is part of it." Pyra smiled again and corrected one of his hand postures. "Don't worry, I've got Undine with me, and I would bet on her every time." Struggling to remember all his lessons, Varen gave up and reached for his slate. With furious tapping, he scribbled out the words that his fingers couldn't speak. "Errik is only a small part. It feels like we haven't considered all the options. This path can only end in countless dead." Pyra took a moment to read the man's tiny handwriting and quirked a brow. "And what option is there that you imagine? March down to Emberrun and ask them nicely?" Chalk tapped against slate. "Maybe. People respect you. Possibly you could broker peace with one or more of the invading countries. As queen, you can—" Following the words as he wrote, Pyra reached out and stopped his hand with a flat look on her face. "As queen, I can do nothing. You assured that." "Then Errik, have him repeat your words." "And what happens when they turn on us? And they will turn on us. Lucian has made sure of this. Errik may have gained some dark power, but he's no match for one army, let alone 3. Varen clenched his fingers into fists for a moment, searching his mind for the words. "I just think—" "No!" Pyra slapped the slate harder than she intended, and it fell to the ground, shattering. "We need Elias." Her breath caught in her throat as she realized an aching pain had settled in her chest. "I need him." Her voice quivered as she looked him in the eye. "He can fix everything." Varen pulled back a step, his hand absently moving to his throat. He knew she was suffering from the loss of her husband, and that this venture was about more than just the kingdom. But he had to make her see. He clumsily signed, "He's not the man you knew before." Pyra slowed her breathing. "I'm sorry for what he did to you. I really am. But what he did at Emberrun, he did for us. For all of us. For Ebra. And it changed him, just like it's changing Errik. We already lost our king. We can't risk losing you as well." "Stop!" Pyra reached out and shoved the prince away. She struggled to contain herself, but the pain inside her was like a seeping wound. "Just stop! Elias was a greater man than a spoiled child like you could ever understand." Hot tears rolled down her cheeks. "Are you afraid of what your brother's return might mean for those soldiers? Or are you afraid of what he might do to you when he sees the state that you have let befall his kingdom in his absence?" Her words hit Varen in the gut. A stagnant pause hung heavy between them for several intense moments before he managed to compose himself with a deep breath and signed, "And what if you can't bring him back?" Then we die on that battlefield, defending Ebra to our last breaths. Pyra's rage spilled over, tears continuing to fall from her face, her anger palpable. As Elias would have. There would be no words that could change her mind. Vera knew that the queen was stubborn, and he would only make things worse if he continued. He nodded slowly, reaching down to pluck up the largest portion of his slate. He wiped away the previous message and tapped out only 2 words before handing it to her. Good luck. Undine watched the prince return to his friends before looking back at the queen. She could see her shaking with rage and moved over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? Shrugging off the gesture with a jerk, Pyra threw the portion of broken slate into the muck as hard as she could before dragging her hands down around her face to wipe the tears from her cheeks. I thought he had changed, Undine, but I should have known better. The dryad looked over her shoulder to see Verin helping the small dwarf rig up their camp. He was always a good boy, just easily influenced by his brothers. But now I see a man who speaks for himself, and... Undine turned back. He has a point. Are you taking his side? Overlooking the accusatory bite in Her Majesty's words, Undine shook her head. No, I want Elias back as much as you do, but I wonder if he will be the same man we remember. He hid it well, but he was different near the end. You speak of him like he's dead. Pyra bit down on her resolve, stifling back another wave of tears. Different or not, he is a good man, and my husband. I would see him back in my arms, and back on his throne. Undine knew pushing the subject farther would only upset the queen. She gave her cheek a gentle caress, wiping the tears from it before offering her a smile. She turned away, looking around the bustle of the camp. Time to go, little king. The dredgelands await. Even though he knew it was empty now, Errik felt his stomach churn and constrict. He took a deep breath, focusing on the knowledge that this small detour would reunite him with his brother. Vel would have the answers, and together they could save an entire country. He felt a tiny hand slap him playfully on his calf and looked down. Be safe out there, and watch out for snakes. Evan, wearing a wide grin, gave him 2 sets of thumbs up. Errik scowled, but was quickly yanked away from the camp and ushered towards the murky path with a sharp prod from the queen's guardian. Looking over his shoulder, he complained, Why would you say that? Pyra stood still for a moment, staring into the mouth of the swamps before she followed in tow. She gave the others one last wistful glance. Verin was watching her with an odd expression on his face, something she hadn't seen on him before. Disappointment? Errik tugged against his own leg, pulling his foot from the thick, inky muck with a squelching pop. He knew they would be traversing through a swamp, but he had been expecting to wade through waist-high waters topped with layers of duckweed and brilliant shades of green. Instead, it felt like he was navigating through cold tar pits. The knee-high water, even though it could barely be considered that, was jet black, smelled of iron, and thick as molasses. Trees jutted up out of the goop in sporadic numbers, and thick clumps of vegetation grew along the base of the trunks or clung to the slowly disappearing land masses.
Couldn't we have found an easier path?
Errik let out a pained cry as he pulled against his other leg, taking another giant step forward. He still wasn't fully recovered, and this was taking its toll. He looked to the others, hoping for sympathy, but came to an abrupt stop when he saw Undine was simply stepping from tree root to tree root like a graceful dancer in a ballet. Bob was pushing through the muck, leaving a trench in the goop that refilled slowly behind him. And Pyra, well, he should have known that the Queen of the Selkies carried more than just the weight of a title. She was walking across the water, barefoot, as though she were merely on a muddy road.
How are you even doing that?
Pyra, lost in thought, was forced back into the moment when she realized that Errik was speaking to her. She pulled to a stop and looked down at him. Oh, this? A smile crossed her face. I am of Selkie heritage, of course, and water is our innate power. Errik struggled to wade through the muck, forcing himself through inch after inch until he flopped out into the wake of Bob's walking. He looked down at his tar-stained clothes with a sigh. So much for his kingly appearance. He looked at her feet, barely affecting the surface tension on the water, and remembered an old barge captain cackling at him as she walked back to her boat in a similar fashion.
Can you use magic?
His ears perked up, a slight grin on his face. He knew he couldn't do what she did, but it would be exciting to see.
Could you part these waters and make a path for us?
No, of course not. Pyra chuckled a little, but a sadness overcame her, and it faded away. Selkies only retain their magic as long as they have their sealskins, and, well, mine was burned as part of my wedding ceremony, a sign of my commitment to the kingdom of Ebra, that I am one of them and a Selkie no more. Appalled, Errik looked up at her in horror.
Wouldn't that kill you, though? How are you alive if your skin was burned?
A small smile tugged at her lips. My sealskin was my tie to magic and immortality. Without it, I am simply mortal. I will age, although slower than humans, and eventually die. But I do so for my people. It is the only way that I can live as they do, be on their level. A heavy silence weighed down between them. Only the cries of far-off birds echoed through the swamp. Errik now realized just exactly what the Queen gave up when marrying into this nation.
I'm sorry for bringing it up.
Pyra shook her head. It's all right. I did so with pride, and do not regret it. But we should hurry, before it gets dark. I don't want to think of the creatures that would come in search of an easy meal. Errik nodded and turned to follow her lead, pushing back into the open trench in Bob's wake, when he stepped down on something even slimier than usual. He pulled his foot back with a grimace and looked down to see a small, brownish-black blob quiver several times before reforming and continuing on. It picked up whatever debris lay near the bottom of the waters, branches or bark, and pushed them up around itself, forming a hard shell. It continued to scuttle away on a vast number of tiny, undulating legs.
Wait. Like he had been struck with a white-hot light, Errik cried out and stumbled back into the muck. These things! I've seen them before!
The memory of a trans-dimensional, sentient ooze beast shot to mind, one with too many eyes and too many teeth. The creature he and his brother fought, what felt like forever ago. Alpha.
If these things are here, we're in big trouble. We gotta get out of here, now!
Pyra turned around, noting Errik's skin had gone the perfect shade of white. She saw him point a shaky finger down to a turtle-like lump, and chuckled. It's not a monster to be feared. She returned to his side and gracefully plucked the small creature from the waters.
It is simply a lost soul.
She brought it to her face, cooing at it in a gentle tone.
Would you be a dear and help us find the life wardens?
Horror warred with confusion in Errik's mind as he watched the queen speak with a small, potentially dangerous monster. One that still haunted his dreams. A lost soul? Wraith, isn't that what you are? He kept his voice low, keeping his eyes on the queen and her newfound pet.
Of course not. That soul is dumb and could not find its way back. I was smart and refused to go back.
That sounded more like an affirmation than an explanation, but Errik let it slide. Back? Back to where? There was a long pause as the shadow bug lost himself in deep thought.
Back to where all things began. Back to the earth, I suppose.
Then what is it doing here? Errik's brows knit together as he looked around.
The Judgelands are where all souls migrate when they die.
Undine stepped off her branch and moved towards them. She took the small goo beast from the queen and let it move around in her hands with a smile.
The ones that cannot find their way, like this little one here, become the wards of the life shepherds, where they help others, such as themselves, until they can complete their cycle.
She bent over and set the tiny creature down in the muck, where it began moving with deliberate intention further along the inky river.
How do you know this?
The queen turned to her guardian. A dryad from the enshrined wilds should have little to no knowledge of this place, and, she must admit, she seemed to know more than Pyra.
Elias told me when we came here, over 50 years ago.
What? Elias came here?
Where do you think he got his power?
Pyra nearly slipped on the surface of the swamp in her rush to Undine's side.
What do you mean? Why did...
Undine held up a hand. She could see that the queen had many questions, and she put her open palm on Pyra's shoulder.
This conversation must wait. The muse is leaving, and we must follow it before we lose it in the swamps.
Errik watched the other two exchange silent words with one another before following the little blob as it undulated across the inky surface of the water. He felt like an outsider, spying on something private. It made him uncomfortable. Or perhaps that was just the way his boots stuck in the quicksand earth as he walked. The further into the swamp they traveled, the more lost souls could be seen. Muses, as the dryad called them, went about their daily lives in slow, ponderous movements. Gentle wisps of light were ushered along by goo creatures of all sizes. Playful, four-legged ones carried the wisps in their maws like young golden retrievers. Human-sized muses carried countless glowing lights, cradled in their arms like children. A somber peace filled Errik as his eyes moved across each one, enacting out their duties, ferrying new souls to their final rest. The fear he had, that normally roused in him when he saw these creatures, faded away. Even when a gigantic muse the size of a woolly mammoth trundled to a stop in their path, trumpeting in broken harmonics. The euphoria that all scientists feel when faced with something new and delightful exploded within him, and his breath caught in his throat. Errik felt a grin form on his face. Is that one of the life shepherds? Undine chuckled softly as she shook her head.
No, but this one guards their home.
Their tiny guide, still encrusted by leaves and twigs, was plucked out of the swamp by the mammoth's trunk, and they began to communicate with one another. It was an eerie sound, reminiscent of hollow wind chimes. It only took a single moment, but it felt like ages as the two creatures spoke with one another in an unknown tongue before the mammoth stepped aside, letting out another bellowing trumpet. The trees appeared to separate, their branches peeling back to reveal an impossibly massive skull of a deer, easily 10 times the size of the largest animal ever known to science. The eye sockets of the skull disappeared into the low-hanging clouds and mist. It was monstrous, too large to have existed in a realm where physics restricted such creatures from supporting their own weight.
Is that?
The remains of the goddess Revaria. Yes. Undine helped free the undead and the false king from the thick waters of the swamp. Around the base of the skull rest a host of bodies, reclined in sleepless death, each set in repose in thrones carved from the very ivory teeth of the fallen goddess. Bodies made up of twisted roots, vines, and bone, tethered together by bits of cloth. A sense of déjà vu fluttered through Errik's mind as the familiarity of the sight began to set in. As they approached, an unnatural shift in the wind rustled the empty branches above them. A blue glow rushed across the sky, and the bodies began to animate. Something was inflating them as arms began to snap into place and spines realigned. One by one, they stood, falling in line behind the largest of them, an imposing figure, made all the more horrifying by the glowing visage behind the mask of a multi-pronged stag skull. The creature leveled a finger at Errik, and he felt his body lock into place, not from fear, but by force. Every muscle, even his voice, seized up in a state of total paralysis. He struggled, but even his eyes refused to obey him as they stared wide at the creature of untold power. A voice like a chill wind across an endless stormy sea echoed out from all directions.
You were warned. Only death awaits the banished.
Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
Right, let's see. Would you rather jump into those refuse pits outside Ebenvane or kiss Bob on the lips?
Dude, gross. Bob, I suppose?
I knew it! You have a crush on the dead guy.
Funny. Okay, my turn. Would you rather go on a date with Willicky or go on another boat ride?
Oh, gods! I may have deserved that, but it was still a low blow.
Maybe, but what's your answer?
Fine. Willicky? No force of nature will ever get me on a boat again.
Okay, Barry, your turn. Whoa! You kiss your mother with that mouth?
Oh, that is just... Good gods, man! I don't think I want to play with either of you anymore.
Just wait until Vel gets back. He loves this game.